Also seen today a bit of a recalibration for Australia and the northern part of the country in an economic sense, which of course feeds into strategic. Joining me now is Peter Jennings from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
So interesting story today. Look, in some ways a confirmation of what we were assuming would be happening here. The Northern Australia sort of plan and policy was always pretty reliant on China in an economic sense. And there's a point now where increasingly we're realising we need to hedge, for want of a better word.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, we've seen China become much more aggressive and assertive in a military and diplomatic sense, really since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. And I think that's finally sort of giving pause for thought in Canberra that building even more dependence on China is something which has the potential to sort of threaten our sovereignty, certainly dampen down government's willingness to be critical in any way. And therefore it seems to me that a strategy which is designed to spread our bets a little bit, encourage investment from India, from Southeast Asia, that's a very sensible thing to do in order to create a bit more diversification for our economy. And
even in the sense of China's current control of the South China Sea, I mean, a lot is spoken about wanting to make sure that this is not cemented, if you like, albeit it's seen as all but in China's hands. What happens right now if there's some sort of conflict or tension, whatever it might be, and China decides to assert that? What would the impact be on Australia?
Well, China certainly has the military capacity to close down shipping and aircraft movements through the South China Sea. And they can do this because they've constructed three quite large air bases just in the last few years there.
And those ones that were never going to be militarised.
The ones that were never going to be militarised. And they have the wherewithal now to move significant military forces down to that area and simply say to the world, right, this is Chinese sovereign territory, no one is going to move through that zone. If that happened, I think it would place the Southeast Asian region and Australia in great difficulty because a huge volume of our trade goes through the South China Sea up north, yes to China, but also to Japan and South Korea. And so, frankly, we underestimated how strategically significant that takeover of the South China Sea was by China. And now we see, in fact, what it presents is a real threat. I would say particularly to Japan, Tom, because Japan is absolutely dependent on energy supplies that go through the Straits of Malacca from the Middle East and then turn left and go up through the South China Sea to Japan.
Which I guess one of the key aspects, if we move away from a lot of vehicles, I guess military might be the last ones, from oil to other sources, whether they be sort of hydrogen or electric based, that we might be able to have slowly less reliance on that. But in the short term, you can't just wait for that to happen. So part of this is Australia being able to trade with closer neighbours, Indonesia and India, without having to rely on going through the South China Sea. So that literally is a physical closeness to be able to, the more trade we have with these countries, the less we rely on stuff going through there.
Well, again, I think diversification for the economy is an absolute must to protect ourselves against the risk of the Chinese economy going south, but also to protect ourselves against what we see in the form of an increasingly nationalistic China, which is intent on dominating the region. So any move economically and diplomatically, I think, to give us some freedom of scope to protect ourselves from that is sensible. I think it also shows that the north of Australia is actually becoming strategically more important because it's right up against this more conflicted and tense area. And in the case of Japan, I think we can see significant Japanese investment into LNG supplies from northern Australia, which is giving Japan insurance against that dependence on Middle East oil going through the South China Sea. So the region is becoming more strategically important. In fact, that's good news for Australia because it gives us, I think, a greater capacity to influence what's going on, particularly in Southeast Asia.
And maintains a real importance with us and these key allies that are also important for us, right?
Indeed, that's exactly right. So there has been, I think, over the years a bit of a tendency from the Defence Department in particular to say, look, let's not overinvest in the north. In some regards, it's treated as a hazardous posting, an arduous posting. But frankly, Australia needs to be able to demonstrate its sovereign control of the north of Australia, of the economic assets that we have in terms of oil and gas infrastructure offshore, and as a demonstration to Japan and to our key ally, the United States, that we're taking the region's security seriously.
When we talk about a shift in Northern Australia policy and we're talking about trade diversification, do we expect something coming out from the government in a concrete sense that says, well, let's reduce Chinese dependence and, down to 20% or whatever it might be? Or is that too sensitive and too obvious? It's a behind the scenes, let's broaden the other stuff and, just keep China steady here. It's not like we're going to stop trading or selling things, but just get more things out to other countries.
I think it's going to be done, the government will try to do this in a fairly quiet way. There's certainly a real neurosis in Canberra about doing or saying anything which might be seen to be critical of Beijing.
Too much so, do you think?
I believe so, yes. I think it does actually us no harm at all to be prepared to speak out for our own national interests in a way that China frankly would recognise.
And if you do it a bit more, then the few times you do it are suddenly less remarkable.
Yes. But what I would hope to see is if the government is intent now on recasting its strategy for Northern Australia, what we should be doing is looking for economic incentives to get Indian investment, to get Southeast Asian and Japanese investment. And
what side do you need those incentives on mainly?
Well, I think there are strong business cases, as we've seen, particularly with Japan and LNG, to want to be involved in the north. But I think we need to be actually going out and doing our best to promote investment in the region, and that might involve looking at tax breaks, at opportunities to partner with Australia in terms of joint investment type activities, using those billions and billions of dollars which are in superannuation funds but seem to be locked and unable to be used for investment purposes. So a bit of creativity, I think, would be really welcome here.
One of the big things is just convincing India with this sort of closed economy that perhaps their political imperative on the transition from how they are now to be ever so slow and not cost any jobs, and perhaps a priority for Modi to keep power, but also to think of it in that strategic sense as well.
I think that's right. I would say that India is slowly changing. It is becoming a country that's slowly, that is reaching out more to essentially the democracies, the developed democracies. I would expect that trend to continue. We have great people-to-people links with India, great tourism exchanges. Investment in both directions, however, has been very limited, and frankly that needs to change.
There's an ability there too, isn't there? Because we have a pretty strong expat Indian community. As Commonwealth nations, there's that natural shared cultural aspect, I suppose. It's a very different Commonwealth, but there's still a similarity even when you talk about cricket. So there's something there to build upon. Do we have a lack of Australians willing to go over to India?
Certainly in a business investment sense, I think that's been the case. It's been regarded as a difficult country for investment, for business to succeed. I think we've also been overwhelmingly focused on North Asia and China in particular.
As China gets harder, maybe for different reasons, India might become
That's right. I think that's another part of the diversification. But, we've tended to rely on that sort of Commonwealth and cricket as being a reason for why the relationship should be closer than, in fact, it really is. And I think, it's very important that the Prime Minister puts that visit to India back on his agenda as quickly as he can after our own bushfire crisis.
The cancelled visit, of course.
The cancelled visit.
Good point.
In order to promote those business connections.
Peter Jennings, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.